The hills of Blackstone stretched for many miles, shrouded in the silvery stripes of morning mist. Here, amidst the lonely houses and dilapidated barns, each new day began slowly, as if reluctant to take its rightful place. The sun had just begun to pierce through the gray haze when Erin Riverstone, the owner of a small animal rescue center, sat down at her kitchen table with a cup of strong tea. Suddenly, her laptop screen flashed with an unexpected message. For sale, horse, urgent, 65% discount. The stern letters, as if typed in haste, were accompanied by a blurry photo of a gaunt animal with a bowed head and empty eyes. The image was grimly bleak. A dirty stall, peeling boards, and dark shadows enveloping the emaciated body of the horse. This ad was presented as a cry for help, veiled in dry commercial language. Erin, shuddering, instinctively covered her cup with her palm to keep from spilling the tea. Her heart ached with pity. Remi, that was the horse's name, according to the text, looked like a victim, betrayed and left to fate. But more than anything, his eyes shone, deep, empty, as if bleached by pain. Erin knew that look. She had seen it in many animals that came to her center. Each of them hid their own tragedy, a silent story of suffering. "I can't bear this," she whispered, as if to herself, but there was already more than just pity in her voice. There was determination. However, practical considerations immediately intervened. Her finances were on the brink. The rescue center, created many years ago, had long been living on the verge of bankruptcy. Constant bills for feeding, veterinary services, and barn repairs left her without funds even for personal needs. She closed her laptop and tried to distract herself with routine chores. But the image of the horse, his sharp ribs, and lifeless gaze haunted her. Every new thought only strengthened the feeling that she could not remain indifferent. After several hours of contemplation, Erin picked up the phone and dialed the number listed in the ad. The ring seemed to stretch for an eternity until finally, a man's voice, harsh and rough, answered. "Yeah? Is this about the horse?" "Yes," she replied, her voice firm. "I would like to know more." "Well, listen," he interrupted with a hint of irritation. "He's still here, but I'm warning you. He's a tough horse. Few can handle him." These words, spoken almost indifferently, only strengthened her resolve. If no one else was willing to take responsibility, how could she refuse? The farm was a few miles from the rescue center, on the slope of one of the hills. It was surrounded by overgrown fields and stone fences weathered by time. The barn looked as abandoned as the rest of the land, peeling paint, crooked doors, and a hollow echo resonating from the wind. When Erin stepped out of the car, she was greeted by a middle-aged man with a heavy gaze. Roy looked like his world had been drained of color early in the morning. "You're here about the horse?" he asked abruptly, without even a greeting. "Yes," she replied, trying to ignore his tone. "Can I see him?" Roy didn't waste time on pleasantries. He nodded and gestured for her to follow. As they entered the barn, Erin felt the familiar scent, a mix of dust, old wood, and musty hay. A few horses poked their heads out of their stalls, curiously watching the stranger. But Remi showed no interest. His stall was dark and narrow. When Erin approached, she instinctively paused. Before her stood a creature that looked more like a shadow than a living being. His once thick bay coat was marred by scars, burn marks, and patches where the fur would never grow back. Dull eyes met hers for a moment before Remi turned away, his entire demeanor shifting as if accustomed to expecting only pain. "What happened to him?" Erin asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Roy shrugged as if it didn't matter. "He was beaten. He'd fall at the slightest touch. I tried everything but this horse," he snorted. "Waste of good horse flesh. Should have sent him to the glue factory long ago." The words hit Erin harder than any argument could. "How much are you asking for him?" she asked, feeling her voice tremble with anger. 1,500, he said without batting an eye. Erin hesitated. That was an insurmountable sum for her in this situation. But the thought of leaving Remi here seemed even more unacceptable. "I'll think about it," she said softly. As she got into her car, the wind rustled the dry grass on the hills, whispering to her that Remi's time was running out. The morning was gloomy, and the gray light barely pierced through the thick clouds when Erin sat in her old car again. Her face reflected determination mixed with worry. Roy's farm, where Remi lived, hadn't left her thoughts. All last evening and night, she had been warning herself of the risks. Could she afford to take in another horse, especially such a difficult case? But her heart left no room for doubt. She knew that if she didn't intervene, Remi's fate would be sealed. The car struggled up the winding, heavy, and stone-scattered road to the farm. When she finally arrived, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth. Roy stood at the barn entrance, just as he had the day before, with a grim expression, as if each day was just another duty to fulfill. "You're back?" he asked without surprise, his eyes scanning her. Erin turned, barely containing her excitement. "Yes, I've decided to take him," she said firmly. Roy snorted, shaking his head. "Your funeral. Just warning you, this horse is a real pain." He didn't waste time on pleasantries and, turning around, headed deeper into the barn. Erin followed him, her steps echoing in the dim light. When they reached Remi's stall, the horse still stood the same way, pressed against the wall with a lifeless gaze. His thin body trembled, and he barely lifted his head to look at the people. 1,500, like I said yesterday, Roy tossed out, leaning lazily against the stall. Erin hesitated. She didn't have that kind of money. "I can offer 1,000. She began cautiously, but Roy shook his head. "Listen, I've already wasted enough time on him. You want him to pay the full amount or get out?" Her hands clenched into fists, but she held back her emotions. If she left, Remi would have no more chances. "All right," she said almost in a whisper, pulling out her checkbook. As she filled out the check, Roy watched her intently. His face expressed ease, and she understood that he genuinely believed she was taking on a useless beast. "He's yours," he tossed out when the check was in his hands. Roy handed her the lead rope. The leather was rough, worn, with spots of dry dirt. This lead was more than just a symbol of fear and pain for Remi. When Erin took it, Remi jerked his head back, stepping away. His eyes widened, and his breathing quickened. She froze, making no sudden movements, and softly said, "It's okay, Remi. This is the end of your suffering. I promise." Her voice sounded convincing enough to reassure not only him, but also herself. Getting Remi out of the barn turned out to be harder than she expected. The horse froze in the doorway, as if paralyzed by the fear of stepping into the world. His legs trembled, and his body tensed. Erin didn't rush him. She gently, patiently tugged on the lead, reassuring him all the while. "You're not alone anymore, Remi. We'll get through this step by step." After several agonizing minutes, he took his first uncertain step, then another. Each step was a struggle, but Erin saw that he was fighting. When they reached the trailer, a new wave of fear gripped Remi. He suddenly tensed, pulling the lead so hard that Erin barely kept her balance. She knelt again, allowing him to see her face. "You're safe," she whispered. "It's okay." Her voice was calm but firm. After a few more minutes, he hesitantly approached the ramp and finally stepped inside. Erin closed the trailer door, her heart beating in sync with his tense breathing. The journey home was long and exhausting. The whole way, she kept talking to Remi, reassuring him so he wouldn't feel abandoned. When they finally reached her center, the sun had risen above the horizon, painting the hills of Blackstone in golden-pink hues. Erin led Remi to his new stall. It was modest but clean. Fresh hay, a bucket of cool water, and a few slices of apple awaited him inside. She carefully removed his lead and stepped back a few paces, allowing him to enter. Remi paused at the door, looking around. His gaze was wary, but no longer as empty as the first time. He took a step inside and, sighing heavily, leaned against the wall. "Welcome home, Remi," Erin said softly. She knew that a long road lay ahead. This horse was broken not just physically, but emotionally as well. But she also believed that with patience and care, she could help him find himself again. As she left the barn, her gaze fell on Remi once more. He didn't take his eyes off her, as if wondering if he could trust this new world. And in that moment, Erin felt that their journey was just beginning. Every day at her rescue center began with routines that required not just physical, but also emotional resilience. But with Remi's arrival, even her iron patience was put to the test. The horse she had brought home at sunset turned out to be even more traumatized than she had anticipated. Remi didn't leave his corner. Even when his stall was filled with fresh hay and water, he waited for Aaron to leave before approaching the feeder. His body remained tense, and any attempt to approach him triggered a panicked reaction. This wasn't just fear. It was a deeply ingrained sense that every movement could bring new pain. But Aaron didn't give up. She devised a plan, a slow, deliberate process she called the circle of healing. The idea was to become a part of Remi's world without invading his personal space. Every morning started the same way. Aaron entered the barn with a bucket of fresh water and a few slices of apple. She placed the food in the corner of the stall and sat at a distance that wouldn't frighten the horse. In her hands was a book, and she began to read. Her voice was soft and steady, almost a whisper that blended with the morning sounds of the farm. Remi didn't respond immediately. For the first few days, he didn't even look in her direction. But over time, as she remained still, he began to cautiously observe her. Aaron noticed this by chance. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught him watching her as she turned a page. This is progress, she thought. On the fourth day, Remi approached the feeder for the first time while Aaron was nearby. Her heart raced, but she forced herself not to move. Even the slightest sound could startle the horse and set him back. He ate slowly, tensely, but for Aaron, this moment was a small victory. However, the path to recovery was far from linear. On the fifth night, when a strong wind rattled the barn, something fell from a shelf, making a loud noise. Remi reared up, his eyes filled with panic, and he slammed against the stall wall. Aaron, alerted by the unusual sound, rushed to him. She didn't approach immediately. Standing a few steps away from the stall, she spoke to him. "It's okay, Remi. It's just the wind. You're safe." Her voice was calm and steady, like an anchor for his wandering mind. As a result, his breathing slowed, and he lowered himself to the ground, sighing heavily. Aaron stayed with him until he calmed down completely. 2 weeks had passed since Remi's arrival at the center, when he took his first step towards Aaron. It happened one evening when she was sitting by the stall with hay. Remi slowly approached, his movements uncertain, but he stopped just a few feet away from her. Aaron froze, letting him decide what to do next. His nostrils flared as he inhaled the scent of her clothes, seemingly trying to determine if she could be trusted. "It's okay, Remi," she whispered. He paused for a moment and then took a step back. Aaron didn't try to stop him. This small moment was proof that her approach was bearing fruit. A few days later, Remi allowed her to come even closer. Aaron cautiously extended her hand, but didn't touch him. She simply held her palm at the level of his muzzle, letting him decide whether to make contact. The horse looked at her, his eyes no longer as lifeless. He hesitated for a long time, but eventually leaned forward, gently touching her hand with his nose. This contact lasted only a second, but Aaron felt a spark of hope ignite within her. She didn't move so as not to startle him, but inwardly she rejoiced. "We're on the right path," she thought. By the end of the month, Remi began to approach her on his own, albeit still cautiously. His movements became less constrained, and the tension in his body gradually eased. He even allowed her to stroke his neck, though he would still step back at any sudden sound. Aaron knew that the road ahead was still long. Remi's traumas were deep, and his past couldn't be erased in just a few weeks. But she believed that with patience and care, they could build a new world where he would regain confidence and freedom. Her work with Remi was not just a job. It was their shared journey, where every step was a small victory over fear. And she was ready to walk this path to the end. Tiny rays of morning sun filtered through the cracks in the barn roof, bathing Remi's stall in soft light. Aaron Riverstone stood at the door, watching the horse. His eyes were no longer as lifeless as they had been on the day she first saw him. Now there was something new in them, a cautious curiosity, a faint glimmer of interest in life. Over the past weeks, Remi had begun to slowly get used to Aaron's presence. He no longer flinched at her every movement and sometimes even approached her. But the path to trust was conservative and winding. Aaron knew that any careless action could instantly plunge him back into the abyss of fear. The soft thud of her boots in the mornings had become a signal for Remi that it was time for breakfast. Aaron entered the barn, carrying a bucket of hay and a few slices of apple she had thoughtfully prepared. She slowly placed the food in his stall and, as usual, stepped back a few paces, sitting on a low stool nearby. However, this time Remi behaved differently. He didn't wait for her to leave, but took a step forward. His muzzle reached for the bucket, but his gaze was fixed on Aaron. She understood. He was studying her, trying to understand if her intentions were truly safe. "You're braver today, my friend," she said, her voice soft and gentle. Remi continued to watch her, but this time he didn't step back. He began to take short breaks to glance at Aaron again. This was a small miracle, and her heart filled with warmth. A few days later, Aaron decided that Remi was ready for the next step. On the neighboring pasture, enclosed by a fence, other horses from her center often trained. She noticed that Remi watched them with interest from his stall. His ears moved in time with their steps, and his eyes followed their every movement. Maybe you should try something new, she thought. She led him to a fenced area where a small jumping barrier stood. It was just a log placed on low supports, nothing complicated, but enough to give Remi a sense of freedom. Aaron led him slowly, giving him time to look around. Remi held himself warily, but didn't refuse to move forward. When they approached the barrier, he stopped, his body tensing. "You can do it, Remi," Aaron said softly, loosening the lead. "No pressure. It's all up to you." The horse looked at the barrier, seemingly trying to decide if he should attempt it. His eyes returned to Aaron, as if seeking confirmation of her words. After a long pause, he took a step forward, then another. His front hooves touched the ground in front of the barrier, and then he awkwardly jumped over it. It was an ungainly leap, far from graceful, but for Aaron, it was magnificent. She smiled, watching as Remi landed, and immediately turned to her, as if asking if he had done it right. "Good boy, Remi," she said with a smile. "You did great." Her words, though spoken softly, had a magical meaning for the horse. His ears twitched, and his eyes softened slightly. He took a few more steps, and for a moment, there was a lightness in his movements that had long since faded. In the following days, Aaron gradually raised the barrier. Each time Remi successfully cleared it, she rewarded him with a gentle word or a treat. This explained his growing lack of confidence at the beginning of the disappearance. Though he was still wary, there was a spark of joy in his eyes. One evening, when the sun had already set, Aaron decided to try something new. She released Remi's lead, allowing him to move freely within the enclosed area. The horse paused, his body tensing, but then he took a few tentative steps. Aaron stood to the side, watching him. He lifted his head, inhaling the evening air with his nostrils, and then began to run along the fence. His movements were smooth and confident. This was a moment of freedom that she had long wanted to give him. "You're finding yourself again," she whispered. Remi stopped and looked at her. In that moment between them, an invisible understanding arose, as if he acknowledged her as an ally. That night, Aaron couldn't sleep. Her thoughts were filled with progress. Each day brought something new, a small victory that filled her with hope. But she also knew that the path to full trust would be long. Lying in the darkness, she softly said to herself, "We'll make it, Remi. We'll get through this together." And in those words was not just a promise, but a conviction that one day this horse would be able to move freely, leaving behind all the fears of his past. Several more weeks passed, and Remi's progress became more pronounced. His movements were more confident, his gaze calmer. Aaron watched with pride as he began to trust her more and more. Each day brought its small victory. He let her run her hand over his neck without flinching from loud noises, and even approach her on his own when she brought food. But Aaron couldn't shake the thought that Remi was ready for more. She saw how he came to life during the exercises on the pasture, where they overcame small obstacles. Each jump came easier to him, and sometimes a glimpse of what looked like pleasure flashed in his eyes. Aaron understood that Remi needed something more to finally overcome his trauma. One evening, sitting at her computer, Aaron stumbled upon an announcement for an upcoming competition. It was a modest event designed for beginner riders and their horses. The arena was just an hour's drive from her farm, and the level of difficulty was low enough not to overload Remi. Her heart raced. The thought of taking Remi to a competition was both inspiring and frightening. Aaron knew that the crowd, the noise, and the new environment could scare him, but she also believed that this could be a necessary step towards his freedom and confidence. "You can do it, Remi," she whispered, looking out the barn window where his figure was dimly visible in the twilight. Preparations began the next day. Aaron made sure to keep her movements as gentle as possible to avoid overstraining Remi. She built a small course of obstacles on the pasture, adding new elements each day. His jumps became smoother, and after successfully clearing each barrier, he more often lifted his head, as if proud of himself. However, not everything went smoothly. One day, during grooming, a sudden gust of wind slammed the barn door shut. Remi, remembering his old fears, reared back, his eyes filled with panic. Aaron lowered her hand, allowing him to calm down. "It's okay, Remi," she said softly. After a few minutes, he cautiously returned to her. These moments reminded her that his past was still close, and she needed to be patient. The day of the competition arrived. Aaron woke up at dawn to prepare Remi. She carefully groomed his coat, braided his mane, and checked every buckle on his tack. The horse stood calmly, his eyes attentive but not frightened. When they arrived at the arena, there was already a lively buzz around them. Riders were preparing their horses, children were running along the fence, and spectators were discussing the upcoming event. Aaron felt Remi tense as she led him out of the trailer. His ears twitched in different directions, and his eyes warily followed every movement around him. "It's okay, boy," she said gently, running her hand over his neck. They approached the warm-up area. Remi looked around cautiously, but with each step, his tension eased slightly. Aaron let him walk around the circle a few times, and then led him to the first barrier. He hesitated, but then jumped over it, as if reminding himself that he had done this many times before. When their turn came, Aaron felt her palms sweat. They entered the main arena, and for a moment, Remi paused, looking around. The noise of the crowd, the bright flags, and the unfamiliar setting called for his justification. "You can do it," she whispered, leaning close to his ear. The sound of the starting bell made him flinch, but Aaron gently nudged him forward. They began the course. The first two obstacles Remi cleared cautiously, his movements awkward but determined. The crowd watched in silence, afraid to disrupt the fragile harmony between Aaron and her horse. At the fourth barrier, something went wrong. A sudden noise from the spectator stands made Remi freeze. His legs tensed, and his body froze in panic. Aaron felt him start to tremble. "It's okay, Remi. I'm here," she said, maintaining her calm. She didn't rush him, allowing him to collect himself. After a few seconds, he took a step forward and awkwardly jumped over the barrier. Aaron smiled, feeling her heart swell with pride. In the end, they didn't win any prizes, but for Aaron and Remi, this was a triumph. The crowd applauded warmly. Aaron leaned down, stroking Remi's neck. "You did it," she whispered. As they left the arena, someone from the audience called out to her. "Is this your first time competing?" Aaron turned and smiled, adding, "And the most important." That evening, when they returned to the center, Remi stood in his stall, his body relaxed, his gaze peaceful. Aaron watched him for a long time, realizing the journey they had taken together. She knew there was still much work ahead, but today Remi had shown that he was ready to fight his past. And this victory was more important than any trophy. Several months had passed since Aaron Riverstone and Remi first competed in the arena. That day had been a turning point for them. Since then, Remi's progress, though slow, had been steady. He had become stronger, more confident, and calmer. His scars were still visible, but there was no longer that constant tension in his movements that once spoke of fear. Every morning, Aaron spent time with him in the pasture, watching as he confidently traversed the space, as if enjoying his newfound freedom. His jumps over the barriers became more graceful, and his eyes were no longer dull. They shone with curiosity and even joy. But most importantly, he was no longer afraid to be seen by people. Remi began to play a significant role in the rescue. Other horses, who had recently received help and were still afraid of human touch, seemed to sense his calmness. His presence helped them relax, and Aaron saw in this further proof that safety could be restored if surrounded by care. One day, a group of visitors came to the center. Among them was a 10-year-old girl with long blonde hair and wide-open eyes. Her name was Maddie. She looked at the animals with interest, but there was something in her expression that immediately caught Aaron's attention. The girl held herself a bit warily, as if she too, like Remi once had, was unsure if the world around her could be considered safe. When they approached Remi's stall, Maddie froze, not taking her eyes off the horse. "Is this him?" she asked softly. "Yes, this is Remi," Aaron replied. "Mom said he was very scared," the girl continued, still not moving. "That's true," Aaron said, smiling gently. "But now he knows he can trust." Maddie slowly extended her hand toward the horse, who watched her intently. Remi didn't step back. His nostrils flared slightly as he inhaled her scent. Then he took a step forward and touched her hand with his nose. Maddie's face lit up with a smile, and Aaron felt a warmth spread through her. "Isn't afraid anymore?" the girl asked, stroking Remi's neck. "Sometimes he still remembers his past," Aaron replied, "but every day he chooses to move forward." Maddie looked at her with unexpected seriousness. "So, if he can, then I can too?" Aaron crouched down to the girl's level and looked her in the eyes. "Of course you can. You have everything you need to be strong." Remi's story began to spread far beyond the hills of Blackstone. People inspired by his journey started coming to the center to learn more about his recovery. Some of them made donations. Others brought feed or materials to improve the center. Aaron hadn't expected their story with Remi to resonate so strongly, but she was grateful for every bit of support. Now she had the opportunity to provide for more animals who, like Remi, needed a chance at a new life. One quiet evening, Aaron sat watching Remi as he wandered freely among the other horses. His movements were smooth, and his ears twitched contentedly. He was no longer the frightened, traumatized creature she had found on Roy's farm. Now he was different, significant, calm-free. Remi stopped and looked at her, his eyes shining with warmth. Aaron stood up and approached him. She ran her hand over his neck, feeling his steady, calm breathing. "You've changed, my friend," she said softly. "You've shown me and the whole world that it's never too late to start anew." Remi nickered softly, as if in agreement. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft black light over the pasture, Aaron knew that their journey was far from over. Each day brought new challenges, but also new victories. Remi had become a reminder for her that even the deepest wounds could heal with patience, care, and love. And in that moment, watching him move peacefully among the hills, Aaron understood. They had both grown stronger because of each other. Their story was not just about rescue. It was about the strength of overcoming, capable of inspiring others. She looked at Remi and, smiling, said, "You didn't just find your light. You helped me find mine." Remi lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers once more. In those eyes, there was no longer fear, only the certainty that his new world would be bright and kind.